I want to welcome everyone back to our second hour of our class here on James. And we were right in the middle of chapter 4 and verse 6 on James, that God gives more grace. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. And we noted that the word resist there is God is setting himself in battle array against the proud, that one who places himself above others, that has a degree of self-estimation that is not warranted. And so God accepts their challenge for battle, and he battles him against that individual. But he keeps on giving grace to the humble. The Greek word that is translated humble is tapenos, and it is literally not rising far from the ground, is the literal meaning of it. And thus it is someone who is of humble or lowly, low degree, someone who is lowly in spirit, as we would see in Matthew the 5th chapter. And verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit. Same aspect or attitude, low to the ground. They realize that they have nothing, that we belong to God, and everything that we have belongs to God. And certainly 1 Corinthians 6 verses 19 and 20 teaches that the Christian has been bought with a price. Therefore we are to glorify God. And thus, we are happy to receive, within the context here in James, we're happy to receive God's grace to satisfy those needs that we have, but not to satisfy our personal desires and our wants. When we have that attitude, then we are setting ourselves against God. But God's going to give grace in regards to those individuals who realize their lowliness. Verse 7, he continues on to say, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Submit is from the Greek word hupotasso. And if you go back to antitasso in the previous verse, resisteth, you have the same root word, tasso, to set or to arrange or to place, and then hupo here means under. So to place or to arrange under. We are to submit, to place ourselves under. Those who are proud try to set themselves against God. Those who submit to God place themselves under God. And when someone tries to place themselves against God, God takes up the challenge. You array yourself against God, God's going to array himself against you. And both of them have military connotations, just with this different prefix, hupo here, under, and anti, against, in verse 6. The word submit here, also resist, and draweth nigh. All three of these are aorist imperatives in the original. And thus they denote immediate action. You right now submit yourselves to God. You right now resist the devil. You right now draw near to God. Immediate action. And it's set forth by a sense of urgency. There is an urgency in doing this. It also, being an aorist, suggests a once-for-all-time action. Thus, we place ourselves in God's ranks and we remain there. And you might tie in with that 2 Timothy 2, verses 3 and verse 4. What is it? We become a Christian. We place ourselves in God's rank and we stay there. We don't move from there. We always are under God. It's like joining an army for life. And in that, we're going to be resisting Satan or fighting against him and drawing near to God. Resist, in regards to Satan, is from the Greek word antaistemi, and it literally means to stand against. You got the aspect of anti against, and istemi, to stand. To stand against also has military connotation. That these are those individuals who place themselves against the enemy and hold their ground. A general calls down, you hold that ground. Well, you hold it no matter what. You're standing against the enemy, and it doesn't matter what the enemy does, you're going to be standing there against him. Now, if we don't do that, if we're not resisting Satan, we're going to be taken by him. He's going to win. Now, if we have powerful aid and effective weapons in that warfare, we put on the whole armor of God that we may be able to withstand Satan. Ephesians 6 chapter verses 10 through 18. And we resist thus by refusing to yield to his allurement, repelling and opposing his temptations. No matter what he does, however he might attack us, however he might try to appeal to us, we withhold, we stand against him. Now, he's got many tricks. He is going to have many devices to try to get us to succumb, but we're not ignorant of his devices, Paul says, 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 11. He's ever trying to seduce us, 1 Peter 5 and verse 11, and consume us, or 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, not 11. And in that battle, he is even going to take the identity of those who are good. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 13 through 15, but we know his tricks. And we have to be there standing our ground, standing against him. And thus, in a confrontation by the saints of God, Satan's going to abandon his efforts, at least for a time. That's what happened with Christ's temptations in wilderness, Matthew the 4th chapter, verses 1 through 11. Jesus resisted him, he left. We will do the same thing. And we have no reason to fear in this because we have those things at our disposal. We have those great and powerful weapons that we can overcome him. And thus we can overcome him. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, God is going to be there with us. He's faithful that we can overcome Satan and his temptations. Now then, verse 8, he encourages us to draw nigh unto God, and he will draw nigh unto you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Drawing nigh to God, again, indicates this decisive once-for-all-time act. You, one time for all time, draw near to God. You draw near to God, that's going to indicate you do it one time, all of time, for all time. It's not going to need to be done again. You've already made the decision. I don't have to make a decision tomorrow morning as to whether or not I'm going to go to services to worship God. Why? Because I made that decision years ago, a long time ago. First, it was made for me by my parents, but then I made that decision as well. There's no decision made. It's a once-for-all-time decision that's been made. I'm going to be there Sunday morning. Well, that's the same thing in drawing nigh to God. And it indicates also that we are not to draw just a step or two nearer to God. We're just God's over here, and we get a step or two over here, and thus we've drawn a little bit nearer. No. That's not the idea. Here is God, and what we do, we approach God completely, totally. And you can study Acts 17th chapter and verse 28 along that line, and the 139th Psalm, verses 8 through 10. And this is part of an overall admonition of James in this section. Notice these four things. First, resist the devil. Second, he will then flee from us. Third, stay close to God. Fourth, he will come close to us. The priest in the Old Testament times, when they went into the sanctuary, it was said of them that they were drawing nigh to God. Exodus 19 and verse 21. And so these Jewish Christians would be that have that type of an understanding. Well, all Christians are priests today. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, verse 5 and verse 9 actually. And thus, when we approach God in worship, this once for all act is when one puts Satan away from sin and humbly comes to God, obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. He draws near to God, completely, totally to God, and he begins resisting Satan. And then God draws near to us. That's what follows our drawing near to Him. The verb will draw, God will draw nigh unto you, is a future tense, and that the promise is conditional. In reality, all of God's promises are conditional. And you might tie in 2 Chronicles 15 and verse 2 with that. Cleanse your hands, he says. This is a Greek word, katharizo. Katharizo. And it originally meant nothing more than a ceremonial cleansing. It was an outward cleansing in that sense. The outward washing of water that was made, that the priest would make to make himself ceremonially clean so he could approach and worship God. The priest had to do that in that brazen laver. They had to wash and bathe themselves before they could enter into his service. Read Exodus the 30th chapter, verses 19 through 21, and Leviticus 16 and verse 4. Well, man came to see that God required more than just that outward washing of the body. And so it came to mean a putting away of all guilt and transgression. And you would see this, for example, in Psalm 26 and verse 6 and Isaiah 1 verses 15 through 17. And so there's a spiritual, used in a figurative sense of putting away of all guilt and of all sin from our lives. Notice in the Scriptures that the different types of cleansings that are mentioned specifically, though. There's first the cleansing of the lips, Isaiah 6 verses 5 and verse 6, which represents man's words. Second, there's the cleansing of the hands, Psalm 24 and verse 4, which would represent man's deeds. And then a cleansing of the heart, Psalm 73 and verse 13, which would represent man's emotions. Now then, tie that in with what Jesus said in regards to loving God with all of our being, with all of our heart, with all our soul, with all of our mind, with all of our being. Our lips, our heart, and our hands. All of those we cleanse. Purify our hearts, he says, refers to thus moral purity. And we would see that in 1 John 3 and verse 4 and also 1 Peter 1 and verse 22 as well. Purifying your hearts. Heart has reference here particularly to the seat and the source of sin within the individual. Purify that sin within your heart. Cleanse your hands would have the performance, the acts of sin. So you cleanse and purify your hearts. What is it? You get to the source of the sin within yourself, within your attitude, your actions. Cleanse your hands, your actions then have to change. Thus, both the source and the means of sin is to be purged if one is to receive the grace that is promised. The double-minded goes back here when he says, ye double-minded in the latter part of verse 8, goes back to that which we studied in James 1 and verse 8. Someone who's wavering between God and the world, going back and forth. His heart's not right. He wants to be with God, yet he still has those desires of the world. Verse 9, he adds, be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy into heaviness. Afflicted here is from the Greek word teleporio, and it signifies to bear or carry something hard. And in this context, be afflicted would be carrying something that is hard of sin. In other words, they were to be aware of the heavy load of sin that they were carrying. That you have a heavy load here. It's something that you can't bear. And thus, speedily turn to God. That's the idea that is being expressed by be afflicted. What is it? You realize the heavy burden of sin, and you immediately turn to God. Mourn is from the Greek word pentheo, and it means to lament, to wail, and it would be used of any loud expression of grief. You see someone, sometimes they go up to the casket of a loved individual, and they just mourn out. Well, that's would be this word, pantheo. Here again, in relationship to sin, the heavy load of sin, that heavy burden of sin, if properly felt, is going to result in mourning and weeping, great grief for their sin. I wonder if we really have that type of attitude toward sin, though. Or if, oh well, sin's not all that bad, you know. What's our attitude toward sin? But specifically here, those who have been in sin should feel the guilt that's involved in that sin, and thus evidence of repentance should come. Those who are in sin are not in a position to laugh and experience joy, even though they had been. And this mourning, again, that's mentioned here. Let your laughter be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning. Here again, it's from the Greek word, instead of pantheo, which is verbal form, it's panthos, which is a noun form, and it originally meant to lament over the dead, and thus to designate great grief. Word suggests an exhibition of mourning. So the laughter which all can hear is turned to mourning that all can see. The laughter and the joy, both of these would be in regards to their sin. They're experiencing over sin. Heaviness, the word heaviness here, comes from the Greek word katapheia, and it means one with downcast eyes, sorrow, dejection. That's the attitude that's being expressed by this word heaviness. It is a sobering consciousness of the weight and the guilt of sin upon his heart, and thus downcast eyes. He's sorrowful. You see the sadness that's there. Sorrowful dejection. A laughter is turned to mourning. He was at one time laughing over sin, but that laughter is turned to mourning over it. And while the outward character, or the laughter to mourning is largely outward in character, the joy to heaviness is more disposition of the heart. And you might tie in what is written in Job 8, verse 20 and 21, and Luke 6 and verse 25 along those lines as well. Verse 10, you see that attitude. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, your joy into heaviness because of sin. Now then, verse 10, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. Humble, again, is from that Greek word tapanoo, and it means to make low again. It's in the passive voice this time. Thus, instead of be humbled, it is humble or instead of humbling yourselves, it is you be humbled. But it's in the imperative mood, which is a command. There is a command to be passive, be humbled. And you might tie in Matthew 23 and verse 12, Luke 14 and 11, 1 Peter 5 and verse 6, all of these would tie in with it. The humility is a voluntary acceptance of a place of lowliness in order to be pleasing to God. That's what we're dealing with now. Voluntarily accepting that place of lowliness so I can please God. It's an acceptance. To be acceptable humility, though, it has to be for the purpose of God and not for the plaudits of men. So that man can say, oh, look at how humble he is. Well, then that humility is false humility. It's not true. And then true exaltation is through that humility. When you humble yourselves in that way, then God will exalt you. And this exaltation basically is that pardoning grace of verses 5 and 6. Only when man realizes his inability to save himself is that individual going to come to God. Now then, verses 11 and 12 is going to deal with be free of worldliness, covetousness, and envy that produce evil speaking and judging that we see now in verses 11 and verse 12. Verse 11 says, speak not evil one to another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. Now, this verse, of course, has close connection with the preceding verses, and they're not subjecting themselves to God, but instead having a haughty, a proud disposition. Well, what does that lead to? Well, that leads to speaking disparagingly of those that they view beneath them. Remember that attitude of haughtiness or that arrogance, that proud disposition is putting yourself above them. Where you place yourself above them, you regard them as lower than you, beneath you. And thus, you speak disparagingly of them. Now, and James had discussed the sins resulting from a lack of love from God. Now then, though, he's dealing with the sins that result from a lack of love for the brethren. Speak is from the Greek word kataleleo. And it means literally to speak down. And it also implies that the person spoken against is not there. It is an unjustly criticizing and insulting and slandering one's actions, words, or life. James 1:26 again deals with that type of an attitude. It's in the present tense, thus he continues to speak down and criticize, insult, speaking evil of. It's in the imperative mood, thus command. This condemns not only the practice of it, but the will to do it. If you want to speak down against others, then that's what's being condemned here. This would not only forbid the expression of harsh words about others, but would also the entertainment of such thoughts concerning them. Put these thoughts from my mind is what our attitude should be. And you might tie in the 15th Psalm in verses 1 through verse 3 and the 101st Psalm in verse 5. There's really very few sins in the Bible that are so unsparingly condemned as that of gossip. And yet it is a problem that faces every congregation in our brotherhood, I do believe. We have a great problem today with gossip and the use of the tongue. Improper use of the tongue, maybe I should say. Where we speak down at others. We go behind their back, and that's what's being expressed here, and it's evil. It's wrong. It is a judging of a brother. Here the judging of the brother, you judgeth your brother, is a forming of an unfavorable opinion about him without being able or willing to know the real character of the person. And it is an imputing of unholy and unworthy motives to other individuals. We can't judge their motives except as they reveal those motives to us. Now, there is a proper judging, of course. We are to judge righteous judgments, John 7:24. That is, a judging that is according to God's standard, God's law. But that's not being involved here. There's a judging that is done when we withdraw fellowship from a brother. We are judging that individual according to God's laws and God and His actions. So you have His actions, you have God's law. His actions don't measure up to God's law, and the Christian has to withdraw his fellowship from Him. We've judged him in that sense. But that's not what's being condemned here. It is a judging of unworthy things and actions. It's just a forming of an unfavorable opinion about that individual because of our likes and dislikes. Now, what does he mean, though, by he judgeth the law? Well, one judges the law by not doing what the law commands. And thus, he considers the law unworthy to be kept. It's not worthy of being kept, so I'm not going to keep it. What is it? He's judged that law. Or he doesn't keep it, and thus he is judging that law in that sense of being unworthy to be kept. In this case, it might be the royal law to which James is talking about, that law that's found in Romans 2 and verse 8, to love your neighbor as yourself. Our responsibility to obey the commands which God has given and not pass judgment on the worth of the law. Verse 12, he adds, there is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgeth another? Some Greek manuscripts add and judge. There's one lawgiver and judge. And the emphasis, though, is that there is only one lawgiver, and if the aspect of judge is there, only one lawgiver and judge. God is only one. God is the only one. He's the only lawgiver, He's the one lawgiver, and He's the only one who has the right to judge in that case. And the one who breaks the law is in reality trying to set himself up as lawgiver and judge. God has the ability, God has the sufficient power and capability. He has the ability to save individuals, deliver us from sin, and that's the aspect, who is able to save and to destroy. And that word able is from the Greek word dunamai, same word as power in Romans 1:16. Gospel is God's power. God is able. God has the power to save, to deliver us from sin, and thus to enable us to enjoy heaven's home with Him. But He also has the ability to destroy, to be completely separated from God. And thus, we might recall what Jesus stated in Matthew 10, verse 28, fear not him which is able to destroy the body, but is not able to destroy the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Well, we are to fear Him because He is able to destroy soul and body. The word destroy here is from the Greek word apolumai, and it means to render useless. It does not mean annihilation, as some who want to teach us that it, or would want to say that it does. There is, again, a difference in rendering in the Greek text. The Textus Receptus has the Greek word heteron, which means another, while the Nestle text has the Greek word plaison. And which means near or close by, and indicates a neighbor. Who art thou that judgeth another, or judgeth one who is close by, one who would be your neighbor? James is saying, how dare you presume to become God and pronounce judgment upon someone else? You do not have the right to judge. You don't have the ability to properly do so. And thus, to try and do so, the effort to do so, is really absurd. You can't do it properly. God is able to, and so don't speak evil. Don't form those type and say those things against your brother. God's the judge. He has that ability to do it. Might tie in Romans 4th chapter or 14th chapter in verse 4 and verses 10 through verse 13 along that line. The next point that we see in this is that we would be free from self-reliance, verses 13 through 17 of James 4. Verse 13, go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city, and continue there a year, and buy and sell, and get gain. A disregard and I have messed up real bad with my notes there. A disregard for God is still the underlying thought in this section. In verses 1 through 10, God is disregarded in preference to this world. Verses 11 and verse 12, they indicate their contempt for God's law by judging a brother. Now then, God is being disregarded in this section in regards to the future. A future from which God is excluded. He says, go to now, which is from the Greek word ago. And it literally means to come now. And that's the way the American Standard, the New King James, and the New American Standard translate. Come now. It is simply indicating to us, you give attention to what I'm telling you. And there's certainly that aspect of it. You give attention to what I'm telling you. They are presumptuous in what they're going to do, that they're going to do this today or tomorrow. I'm going to do this today or tomorrow. I am going to do it. Second, there's a presumptuousness concerning the city to which they're going to go to. I am going to go into this city. Third, there's a presumptuousness as to how long they will remain in the city. I'm going to remain there a year. Fourth, there's a presumptuousness about their business. I'm going to buy and sell and get gain. How do they know that they're going to get gain? Fifth is that aspect, they are presumptuous about the results of that business. I am going to get gain. So you start seeing 5 areas of presumptuousness in this figure that James is using. So notice, keep in mind these 5 aspects of this presumptuousness. James is, in this, presenting a contemporary pictures which his readers would be very familiar with. The Jews were great traders of the ancient world. When a city was founded, they would offer citizenship to Jews. So here's a man. He looks at a map, opens the map, looks at it, he finds a certain city. He says, I'm going to go to that city, and I'm going to spend a year or 2 there, and I'm going to make my fortune, and I'm going to come back rich. These men had their plans laid out well. They carefully thought out those plans. They had then adopted those plans. Now, the error that they made was not in making plans and carefully planning things out. But their error that James is dealing with is that in their planning, they left out God. We're reminded of Luke the 12th chapter, verse 16 through 21, in relationship to that man who pulled down his barns, built greater barns, and this night thy soul shall be required of thee. How does he know he's going to be able to live and act in that way? These individuals that James is dealing with are acting and planning as though everything was in their own hands and by their own power. I am going to do this. Everything is within my control. That's the way they're planning now. And they are leaving God out of those plans. God has nothing to do with this, in effect. Verse 14, thus. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then vanisheth away. How foolish they were for making plans for a year of tomorrows. And they didn't even know what was going to happen on the first of tomorrow. I said first of tomorrow. It should be the first tomorrow. They've got a year of tomorrows. What about the first one? You don't even know what's going to happen there. How can you make a plan for 356 of them? So we do not have the right to make constant and confident plans for the future, very simply because we don't know what the future is going to bring. And that's teaching of Proverbs 27 and verse 1, and going back to that which we mentioned just a moment ago in Luke 12, verse 16 through 21. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. How can you make confident, consistent, constant plans for a year from now? Now, you might make plans. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't know what's going to happen. They don't even know if tomorrow they will be able to do so and so. Second, they do not know if they will be able to go into this certain city that they plan. Third, they do not know if they will be able to stay there a year. Fourth, they did not know if they would be engaged in the business they propose. Fifth, they don't know if they're going to make a profit out of it or not. All of those things are involved in this aspect that he is presenting to them. So James is telling them, you stop and consider what your life consists of. What's the character, the nature of your life? Well, life is nothing more than a vapor. Vapor is the Greek word atmos. And it is a breath, mist, or vapor. Either the steam or the smoke in regards to that vapor. James is making a play on words here. Life appears, and then in a moment it disappears. And you might tie in the 39th Psalm, verses 4 through 6, and Job 7, verses 6 through 10 along that line. Even if we should live 70, 80 years, what's that in relationship to eternity? It's still just a vapor that is appearing for a little time. And then it disappears. Even in those 70 or 80 years would be the 70 or 80 years of Psalm 90 and verse 12. It's still just a vapor. Even a vapor in relationship to the history of the world. 70 or 80 years is nothing in relationship to the thousands of years, 6,000 years or so that this world's been in existence. What about the frailty, the fleetingness of life is emphasized all through the Scriptures, and we need to thus remember that frailty of life, that we can pass from this life at any time. 27th Psalm in verse 1, Job 14 in verse 1, Job 7 in verse 6 through verse 10, 1 Peter, the first chapter in verse 24. And thus, all plans have to depend on the continuation of our life. That's but frail and uncertain. And we might not even have the 70 or 80 years that's given to us. Some individuals only have a few days that are given to them. Others have those 70 or 80 years, and people die at all ages. Thus, we never know about the continuation of our own life. Why make plans without God in those plans? Leaving God out of them when we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. Verse 15, he then says, for that we ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. Here's the proper attitude in our planning for the future. There's nothing wrong in planning for the future. But we have to be mindful of the fact that everything we purpose is dependent upon God and His will. And thus we form all of our plans, all with reference to God and His will, realizing that we might not even be alive tomorrow. We might tie in some of these passages with that, Acts 18 and verse 21, 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 19, 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 7, Hebrews 6, verse 3, Proverbs 3 and verse 6. Everything is dependent upon God and His will. This statement here in verse 15, for ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that, does not mean necessarily that we must give utterance to this or say this phrase, but in our formulating, or planning these plans, it's a realization God's in these plans. I know that God can change these plans. It's as God's will. It's not necessarily saying them. It's kind of like calling upon the name of the Lord. How do you call upon the name of the Lord? Well, some would say, well, you just say Lord. Or Lord Jesus, come into my heart. No, it's not a verbal expression. It's an action, as we would see in Acts 22:16 and Acts 2, verse 16, or excuse me, verse 21 and verse 38. It's an action, not a statement. Well, here, it is not a statement that he is stating. It's not a formula that we say, if the Lord wills. Now, there's nothing wrong with saying it. But it's not to be simply a trite, ritualistic statement. It is a recognition that God's hand is in the affairs of man and our consciousness of a complete dependence upon God. Those who are presumptuous are those who leave God out of their plans. But when we meet, those who meet with God's approval are those individuals who include God within their plans. Verse 16, but if ye rejoice in your boasting, all such rejoicing is evil. Rejoice is from the Greek word kakaomai. Kakaomai. It means glory or boasting. The word boast is from the Greek word alazonia, and it means pride or pretentiousness, a vauntingness, a braggart, or someone who's egocentric. So you're glorying, or that's the word rejoice, you're glorying or you're boasting, all such, you rejoice in that boasting, you glory in your braggart, in your pride. They felt, their attitude was boastful. Not that they only felt self-sufficient, but that they sought to leave the impression upon other individuals that they don't need any God. God's not important to them. And this word boasting, that Greek word alazonia, again, suggests a calculated effort to claim sufficiency without God. Only other time this word is used is 1 John 2 and verse 16, where it's translated pride. So there's that pride. This boasting is founded upon the wrong view of yourself and what may occur. You may have forgotten your dependency upon God and the uncertainty of life. You've gone so far as to boast about your independence from God. All such boasting, all such action is evil, it is sinful. Rejoicing is not evil. Instead, it is taught that we are to rejoice, but this type of rejoicing is evil. This type of rejoicing that says, I don't need God, that's evil. Verse 17, then, therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. This idea is really a development from what we see in verse 16 and what we've seen all in through this. In view of what is said, forming plans respecting the future. That's what it has reference to. The good here, he that knoweth to do good, that is, those individuals who make plans based upon God and upon God's desires. You know about this now, so if you do not do it, it's sin. Now then, question is, should this aspect, or this attitude of verse 17, he that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him that is sin, should it be limited to the making of plans based upon God? Or does it have a general application to any good? Well, I think the answer, if you go throughout the Scriptures, you start seeing that God has ordained or ordered our actions. Matthew 25, 42 through 45, John 13 and verse 17. Thus, when we have the ability and the knowledge to do something, to do good, in any case, doesn't matter whether it's making plans based upon God or in any case, anything else, it imposes an obligation upon us to do it. The negative would also be true. If our obligation to do that which is good, when we know to do it, we must avoid that which is wrong by the application of the knowledge that we have. We have an obligation to do good. We also have an obligation not to do evil. Stay away from that evil, based upon the knowledge that we have. Now then, basically what this is saying forth is the sin of omission. Omitting to do what we should do. Failing to do something we should. There are sins of commission, that is, doing something which we should not do. This is omission, failing to do what we should do. How often, though, do we view in our minds the sinner, or that individual who fails to do something that he's supposed to do, in the same way we do as that individual who does something that he's not supposed to? That one who commits a sin of omission, do we view him in the same way as that sin of commission? Sometimes this verse is also used to teach that where there is no knowledge of good, there is no sin. An illustration of that would be a child who has not reached an age of the knowledge of what God has ordained. But there's a warning to that. It can only be taken so far. The illustration of a man in deep, dark Africa who does not know God and what God has ordained, he's still a sinner, Acts 17 and verse 30, because all men are required to come to a knowledge of God and of His will, Romans 1, 19 through 21. So there's that aspect of it. Let me give you another way to outline the 4th chapter of James, and we'll end with this. But we could outline it by the aspect of the Christian, or one who is at variance with God, is the one, verses 1 through 10, preferring the world to God. Verses 11 through 12 shows contempt for others and God's law. That's one who is at variance with God. Or verses 13 through 17, the one who is at variance with God is the one who has presumptuous confidence in the future. Well, our time's up for our class today, and so I hope that these things have been helpful to you, and we will enter into our study in